forgive us when we fall short of you.
Amen. Okay.
Mark, real quick,
Yes, sir.
just although this group doesn't need much encouragement, but Sunday morning, Frank Daniels will be here for our Bible study and our worship time. Just remind everybody that. I don't think we said anything
Okay.
last Sunday
Yeah.
about that, but be sure and be here.
Yeah.
Like I said, this group doesn't have to be
Yeah,
encouraged
yeah,
too much.
yeah.
But anyway,
Frank's good. You know, as you know, he's a good preacher. He'll bring us a good message. A good Bible class too. Okay, so, and I want to especially thank those of you who brought chili Sunday. That chili was good. That was good stuff. We need to do that again. That was just good. So anyway, here we are, Nehemiah Chapter 7. Let's just jump right in there. Come on. Did this last time. Try again. Sorry. I tried this out once and it did it. There we go. All right, let's start right away. First couple of verses. Now, when the wall was rebuilt and I had set up the doors and the gatekeepers and the singers and the Levites were appointed, then I put Hanani, my brother, and Hananiah, the commander of the fortress, in charge of Jerusalem. For he was a faithful man and feared God more than many. So we talked last week, the walls were completed, the doors and the gates were finally installed. And how many days did it take them to do that? 52 days, okay? They had been in disrepair for over 100 years, but in 52 days, they got it all back together. So, I'm convinced when I look at the details in this chapter, just looking at the details in this chapter, I'm convinced that Nehemiah's writings, I think, were intended to be an official record of everything that was being done in and around Jerusalem. He may have even, I said this last week, but I'm more convinced of it after looking at this chapter more in depth. I really think he was doing what the king of Persia had instructed him to do. I want you to keep an accounting of everything that goes on there. You know, it's a part of his kingdom. It's a very small part of his kingdom, but it's a part of his kingdom, and I'm sure he wanted to have a record of that. We're getting into a period of history when you start with the Persians where the written accounts of things that are going on become pretty important. Even before the demise of the northern and southern kingdoms, we see that really the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Kings were kind of an official record of everything that went on for posterity's sake. So I really think that Nehemiah wrote this not from the standpoint of someday believers are going to look at this and read this. I don't think he had any idea that was going to happen. But I think he was in his official capacity now as the appointed governor of Judah. He's keeping a record of all this. Okay. Now, everything at this point is in order, both practically and spiritually. Everything is in order practically because the walls are completed, the gates have been hung, there is protection now for the city, and the walls that have been dilapidated for so long are finished. So practically, everything is in order. Spiritually, everything is in order because he just talks about in these first couple of verses that the priests and the Levites and the gatekeepers and the singers, they'd all been appointed to their various positions to do their work that they were supposed to do. So everything is in order. Everything is in workable order the way it's supposed to be. And let's remember, the walls were not rebuilt for the people to look at, okay? The walls were rebuilt so that the people could worship God with more safety and more freedom. Don't forget, the first order of business when they returned the first order of business for these exiles when they returned to Judah and Jerusalem was to do what? Rebuild the temple. Okay. And once the temple was built, that was the first and most important thing. Get that temple rebuilt so that we can go back to offering the sacrifices, so that the high priest can function the way he's supposed to, and so that people can offer their sacrifices and do the things that the temple was designed to do originally. It wasn't as glorious a temple as it was before, but it was done. And so now that the temple is done, I think we can safely assume that the second most important thing, second to the temple, was rebuilding the walls. And then they could use the temple and worship with some safety and with some freedom. And I say that because remember what it was like before the walls were built, and Nehemiah shows up. Ezra shows up, and they've all married foreigners. Remember what a mess that was, you know? And I think perhaps, I'm just thinking here, that perhaps the walls being torn down and the walls not giving them any separation from those native peoples around them may have contributed to that kind of contamination by the peoples around them. And having the walls and, being more restricted in where they were and what they were doing, I think may have kept them unified to a certain degree. All right, now, we also see in these verses that Nehemiah had the wisdom to turn his responsibilities over to somebody else. And he said, I turned it over to my brother Hanani. Now, Hanani should be a familiar name with you, because in the very beginning of Nehemiah, one of the people who reported to Nehemiah the condition of things in Jerusalem was Hanani. And now Nehemiah has appointed him to kind of be co-director of the city of Jerusalem. Now, that has the appearance of nepotism, doesn't it? Family favors, because he was the brother of the governor, that's why he got that appointment. Sounds that way. And that happens sometimes. That happens. When John F. Kennedy was elected president, he appointed his brother to be his attorney general and everything. He probably wouldn't have gotten that appointment if his brother hadn't been president, but that's just the way it goes. But here, I don't think we can say it was just nepotism, because I think Hanani was very, I think to Nehemiah, Hanani's description and the sorrow that he felt so deeply with the fact that Jerusalem was in such an awful shape told Nehemiah, Hanani really cares about Jerusalem. And Hanani did a good job of communicating to his brother Nehemiah, who was the king's cupbearer back in Susa, the capital city, and he was enjoying a pretty good life, But the message of Hanani really touched Nehemiah. And Nehemiah may very well have used as part of his inspiration to go do something about it, the fact that his brother was so affected by it. And so now he's putting Hanani in charge, but not just Hanani. Along with Hanani is also Hananiah, who was already the commander of the fortress. So he was already the commander of the fort, Jerusalem, so to speak. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But he didn't put Hananiah, I'm convinced he didn't put Hanani in charge just because he was his brother, and he didn't put Hananiah in charge just because he was the commander of the fortress, because he says why. He says he was a faithful man and feared God more than many. He was a man, he was the man for the task. Was he a soldier? Yeah, he wasn't really a soldier because they didn't have an army, okay? But he had some leadership qualities about him for sure. So I think it's important too to realize that even though Nehemiah had been appointed by King Artaxerxes of Persia to be the governor of Judah, I think it's pretty obvious here that he is ready to turn the reins over to somebody else. Now, remember last week, you remember old Tobiah and Sanballat and Geshem. You remember one of the things they said, well, hey, you know what they're saying about you? They're saying you're trying to build a kingdom and you're wanting to be king and everything like that. And perhaps this was Nehemiah's response to that. I'll show you that I'm not interested in being king. I'm appointing these guys to be in charge, not me. Okay, but that's what he did. All right, going on. Verse 3. Then I said to them, do not let the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot, and while they are standing guard. Let them shut and bolt the doors. Also appoint guards from the inhabitants of Jerusalem, each at his post, each in front of his own house. When trying to translate Hebrew into English is sometimes difficult. And based on looking at other translations, I think what he means by this is the first part's pretty easy to understand. He said, do not let the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot. What do you think that means? Do you think they used a thermometer to decide when to open the gates? What do you think he meant by that? Midday. Midday. Till the sun, I think till the sun is at its brightest, till the sun is at its peak. Why?
See what was going on.
You see what's going on? I think it's pretty simple. So you can see what's going on.
And it's pretty obvious they really wanted to restrict or know who's coming and going.
Absolutely. So if there's dim light, or if there's daybreak and dusk, you really can't see as well. In fact, I got to where I wouldn't even ride my motorcycle at dusk because I felt like people couldn't see me. So I like for the sun to be way up in the sky, shining down pretty evenly on everything. I didn't like tall shadows or anything like that. And it's for security. But when it says, do not let the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot, and then it says, and while they are standing guard, I think what he's saying there is the gates should be open only when there's plenty of sunlight and when somebody is standing guard. Because remember, there were lots of gates, and every one of those gates was going to be a place that needed patrolling, needed some supervision and monitoring and things like that. It's pretty common in this day and time. In the summer of 1973, I worked as a youth minister for a church down in Homestead, Florida, and at the time there was an Air Force base there in Homestead. And one of our elders was one of the colonels. He was one of the highest ranking colonels there at the Air Force base. And because of that, I had a lot of privileges, because of he gave me this little sticker to put on my car. And when I'd go through the security gate, the guys, they weren't looking at who was in the car. They were just looking for that little sticker. When they'd see that sticker, apparently it let them know what Colonel Robertson's rank was, because they'd see that sticker and they'd immediately do this, and then I'd go by like this, and then they'd look at me and give me another gesture that wasn't very kind, But the benefits of being with him, with Colonel Robertson, was I could come and go from the base. I could go to everything. I could go to the movie theater. I could go to the bowling alley. It was really neat. I'd never had any experience with the military before. There were some pretty neat perks. Also, I got in a couple 3 times to see President Nixon. President Nixon. Nixon would fly down from Washington to Homestead Air Force Base, and then get on a helicopter and fly over to Key Biscayne, where he had a home. And so when he'd fly in on Air Force One, Colonel Robertson would tell me about it, and I'd go up there. I'd get into this little place, and Nixon would get off the plane and come through this little building and shake hands with all of us. And I was the only non-military person who was ever there. And everybody in the military, has a name tag. So he would call everybody by name except for me. And I really wanted the President of the United States to call me by my name. I felt like going out and buying a little name tag or something so he could say, hello, Mark, so I could hear the President say that, but he never did. But anyway, the point I was making was, back then, that was 1973. Things were a little different back then. When you were in the military, and you wanted to go back and forth in and out of the base, was that a pretty complicated thing, or were you able, pretty simple and pretty post sticker? That's what I had, but we know that those gates have to be monitored. We know that, and it'd be silly just to leave those gates unmanned. I don't know, about 5 years ago, I guess, we were going through Rapid City, South Dakota, and I wanted to visit with an old dentist friend of mine, and so I got on my GPS and plugged in his office address, and we were just following the route it was taking us, and all of a sudden we end up at this gate to this military base, And so I showed him on the GPS, it's telling me to go this way to get, you can't go through here, Not you little civilian, you can't do that, you got no. So I said, well, let me turn around. Well, no, you can't just turn around. So we had to relinquish our driver's licenses and everything to them, and then go on through the gate while they watched us make the U-turn and come back through. Then they gave us our credentials back and everything. That's how careful they are about that. I'm like, hey, do I look like a terrorist? Apparently, the terrorist can look like anybody. So anyway, but that's what you have to do. You have to provide that kind of security for your own safety, and that's what they were doing. So that's why he says here, also appoint guards from the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and they were to do basically these guards were to do two things. They were posted at certain posts, and one of the most important posts would be by the gates, and also in front of his own house. And what better way to provide security than ask somebody to be a guard over his own property? You're going to be much more diligent about watching out for your own property than you are for somebody else's. But one thing is important in these verses. We see that there is a need for protection. Remember, the Sanballats and the Tobias and the Geshems and all those others are still out there. And they're not just going to throw in the towel. They're going to look for every opportunity they can to sabotage what's going on in Jerusalem. And Nehemiah was aware of that. So he was going to provide necessary precautions, and that's what he's doing here. So, like I said, the walls provided security, but the gates required constant monitoring. The gates were be opened late and closed early. And as in Christian life, we have victory in Jesus, but we still must constantly be on guard. We have the assurance that Jesus has died for our sins and that we have a home in heaven. But we still have to be on our guard. We have to watch out for the evil influences and the work of the devil and the work of the world and everything like that. We're still in need of protection. We still have to watch out. Okay, so you know that. Now, let's go on to verses 4 and 5. Now, the city was large and spacious, but the people in it were few, and the houses were not built. Then my God put it into my heart to assemble the nobles, the officials, and the people to be enrolled by genealogies, or by families. Okay. Then I found the book of the genealogy of those who came up first, in which I found the following record colon. Now, the rest of this chapter is going to sound just like Ezra chapter 2, because that's what he's looking at, is the original record. Okay? So let's talk about that in just a second. The city's now enclosed, and Nehemiah observes two very obvious things. First of all, the population was very low. For the amount of square footage within the walls of this city of Jerusalem, the density of the population was not very big. It had once been a very, very important city. And it was still the same size, area-wise, but the population was very low. And also, when he says there, back here it said something about, and the houses were not built, a better translation of that is that the houses were not occupied. And there were many, many abandoned houses. And that makes sense, because the population of Jerusalem isn't anywhere close to where it once was. So the houses and things the ones that were left standing. And when he talks about the abandoned houses, he's probably talking about houses that were in a total state of disrepair too, some 150 years later for sure. You know, so that's the condition of the city. Its population is low, and the houses are not in the best of condition, and many of them are not even inhabited. Okay. And I love this phrase. He said, "My God put it into my heart to assemble the nobles and the elders and the leaders of the city together." I just love that. My God put it into my heart. I hear people say sometimes, I heard somebody say at the banquet the other night, "Jesus told me." And I hear people say, "Yeah, God told me to do that." And that's just not right. And it's not just that I think it's not right. The scriptures clearly state that God doesn't do that anymore. He doesn't speak to us directly. He does not do that. So when I have questioned people who say that, and I'm sure if I questioned the young lady who said at the banquet the other night, "Jesus told me," that she would tell me, "Well, I didn't really mean that he talked to me directly. I just meant that, you know, I could feel that he wanted me to do that." Well, then say that, okay? Because when you say, "God told me to do this," or "Jesus told me to do that," you don't understand that most people out there don't have any knowledge or perception of the Holy Spirit. So when you say, "God told me," or "Jesus told me," I can guarantee you what they're thinking is, "Wow, God talks to him directly? God talks to her directly? He doesn't do that with me." Okay? That's what they're thinking. Because even though you may say, "Well, that's not really what I meant by that. I meant that the Spirit moved me," they don't understand that. They have no concept of that. So don't say that. If what you're really trying to say is the Spirit moved me, then do what he did. And God put it into my heart. He didn't say God. In fact, you're never going to find Nehemiah once say that God spoke to him directly. He didn't. But what he does say, "I prayed to God and God put it in my heart," or God decided to do this for us. But he doesn't ever say, "God told me." Okay. Politicians do that. We have one politician in particular right now who says things, and it just tickles me, kind of makes me mad in some ways. This certain politician will say something, and within 24 hours, all of the people who support him have to explain to us what he meant by what he said. You know? Well, we heard what he said, you know? Why do you have to explain to me what he meant by what he said? You know? And so, don't leave people in a situation where somebody else has to explain to you what you meant by what you said. Just say it the right way. And if you have to, borrow these words from Nehemiah. "And God put it into my heart to assemble the nobles and the leaders," and all that. Okay, now, that's just a little side thing. Okay, now, let's go on. Nehemiah, he wanted the city to prosper and grow. He wanted the city to prosper and to grow. And so he decided very wisely that if we want this city to grow, if we want these houses to be inhabited, let's just see how our growth is going. Okay? Have you ever Googled a city? Sometimes, you know, I'm just curious as to how big a city might be, and I will Google that city and see what the population is, just to see how close I am to what I estimated the population to be. And maybe you've Googled Clarksville and done that very thing. I Googled Clarksville a while back because somebody was giving me the rigmarole that I didn't know anything about immigration and everything like that. You know, I lived in a place where immigration didn't have any impact on my community, and so I Googled it. And if you Google Clarksville, Arkansas, it'll give you the demographics. And in the demographics, you find out it may not be what you think it is. You know, 58% of the population of Clarksville is Caucasian. 58. That's not that high. You know, And then you get to looking, you know, like 38% Hispanic. And so my point in that is, if you want, and if you Google Clarksville, I encourage you to do this. You can go back. It'll have the census there, and it'll take you starting with 2020 and go back every 10 years, and you can see what the population of Clarksville has been through all those years, going back about 100 years, maybe more. And it's really interesting to see some of that with some of these cities that I Google, because you'll find that there might be a city in Arkansas right now that may have 8,000 people. There was a point in time when there were 15,000 people who lived there. There are a lot of places. In fact, I think, if I'm not mistaken, more than half of the 75 counties in the state of Arkansas are actually decreasing in population. So there are many towns that are getting smaller. But one way you can gauge how your city is doing, and Clarksville's doing fine, okay? If you go back, if you start like in 1940 and you look at the census figures for Clarksville starting in 40 and going to 50 and going to 60 and going to 70, you're going to see a steady growth. You're going to see a steady growth up to where we are now, which is about 9,700 or so. You know, and some people think that figure may be a little low, but you have to have kind of a starting point. You have to have some measure to measure future figures against. So that's what Nehemiah is doing here. He's going to take a census, and then he's going to compare the census, the new numbers, to the registry that was first recorded in Ezra chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. And we went through that chapter. And it's very boring. So we're going to do it in rapid fire speed this time around. Okay, so here we go. He starts out in Nehemiah 7 verses 6 and 7. These are the people of the province who came up from the captivity of the exiles who Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away, and who returned to Jerusalem and Judah. Each to his city, who came with Zerubbabel, Jeshua, Nehemiah, not this Nehemiah, a different Nehemiah, Azariah, Ramiah, Nehemiah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mizpareth, Bigvai, Nehum, and Balaam. Okay. So he starts by saying, these are the numbers recorded by Ezra. He doesn't call Ezra by name, but he said, these are the numbers recorded by Ezra and presented to the king of all those who made that initial journey back. These are the people who came. And I want you to know, these people were important to God. That's why they are remembered. That's why their families are named twice in Ezra 2 and again in Nehemiah 7, because they were important to God. Why? Because they had a pioneering spirit. They were willing to endure hardship. Life was easier in Babylon and Persia, but life was better in Jerusalem because there was the temple, and there was the history, and there was the promise, evidence of the promises that God had made to his people. Okay? Only 2% of the exiles returned. That's why he talked about how the city was real big, but there weren't very many people in it. Okay? Because only 2% of the exiles who left when they were taken away into captivity in Babylon returned. And they're named here because it was a part of God's plan. All through the prophets, he talked about a remnant is all I need. A remnant is going to return. This is that remnant, 2%. Okay? And they're important to God. And that's why he names them. Okay? Now, it's much too late for our names to appear in the Bible. Okay? But it'd be neat, wouldn't it, if your name appeared in the Bible? Sure, especially in a positive way like these people. Okay? But don't forget that in Malachi chapter 3, we're told that God has a book of remembrance. There's another book, a book of remembrance. And God's reserved a place for us in that book. That's to me an even more important book. Okay? But that's why these names are remembered, because they accomplish God's purpose of a remnant returning from captivity. All he needed was a small group of people he could call his, from whom he could bring a Savior into the world. That was his plan. Okay, now, all right, in these verses, starting with the last part of verse 7 and going through verse 38. In these verses are listed the families among just the general population of Israel by family. Parosh, Shephatiah, Arab, Pahath, Moab, descendants of Jeshua and Joab, Elam, Zatu, Zakai, Binuai, Bebe, Asgad, Adonikam, Bigvay, Aden, Ader, descendant of Hezekiah, Hashem, Bezai, Hariph, Gibeon, men of Bethlehem, and Netopha, Anathoth, Beth-Maveth, men of Kiriath Jearim, Shephirah. We talked about Shephirah last week. You might remember that Shephirah was a name for just a group of little cities. If you remember that, that's where they were. Sanballat and Tobiah tried to lure Nehemiah into to have a little group meeting with them. Okay, and Beeroth, men of Ramah and Judah, men of Michmash, men of Bethel and Ai, men of the other Nebo, sons of the other Elam, Haram, the men of Jericho, sons of Lot, Hadad, and Ono, Sinai. Okay, now, those are the first people listed. If you look at those scriptures, there'll be numbers by each one of those families. Okay, now, we're not going to. Then in these verses, 39 through 42, are listed. Remember that? Those last few verses were just the general population. This is the population of priests from the sons of Dedaiah, Jeshua, Immer, Pashur, and Hiram. Then in these next couple of verses are the Levites, the sons of Jeshua, Kadmiel, who's a descendant of Hodavah, and the singers, the sons of Asher, and the gatekeepers from the families of Shalom, Ader, Talmud, Akab, Atida, and Shobay. All right. Levites. These were those who were not descendants of Aaron, but they were of the tribe of Levi. And among those you had singers and gatekeepers and other servants who served the priests. Next few verses, next 10 verses. In these verses are listed the temple servants, okay, servants of the temple. Some of these were Levites, and some of them were not. But they were the families of Zihah, Hasupha, Tabaoth, Kiros, Sia, Padon, Labana, Hagabah, Shalmei, Hanan, Gadel, Nahar, Reiah, Rezin, Nakoda, Gazam, Uzzah, Asiah, Bezai, Meonim, Nephishezim, Bakbuk, Hakapha, Harher, Mazlith, Mahida, Harsha, Barkos, Sisera, Tema, Neziah, and Hadapha. And you're probably at this point going, Mark, why are you trying to pronounce all this? And the reason why I am is for this reason. These people were important to God. And if they were important enough to God to list their families by name 2 places in the Bible, the least I can do is try to read their names, okay? So I know you want out of here, but I'm going to do that anyway, okay? So, in these verses are listed the sons of Solomon's servants. To me, that's kind of interesting. Solomon, he hadn't been around for a long time. We're talking, what, 1,500 years maybe or so since Solomon was around? It's been a long time. But yet, his descendants are still remembered. And the sons of Solomon's servants are even listed. Sotai, Sephareth, Perida, Jalah, Darkon, Gedel, Shephatiah, Atil, Pochereth, Hazabane, and Ammon. Then we look at these verses, and I spelled these out because this is a little different story. We saw the same, and you're going to remember this if you remember what we talked about in Ezra chapter 2. This is almost word for word what we read in Ezra chapter 2. All right. These were they who came up from Tel Melah, Tel Harsha, Cherub, Adon, and Immer. But they could not show their fathers' houses or their descendants, whether they were of Israel. The sons of Delaiah, the sons of Tobiah, the sons of Nakoda, 642. Of the priests, the sons of Hobai, the sons of Hakaz, the sons of Barzillai, who took a wife of the daughter of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and was named after them. These searched among their ancestral registrations, but it could not be located. Therefore, they were considered unclean and excluded from the priesthood. The governor said to them that they should not eat from those holy things until a priest arose with Urim and Thummim. So there's a list of people here who could not provide documentation of their ancestry. Some of them could not prove that they were literally pure Israelites, pure Jewish people. Others may be able to establish the fact that they're Jewish, but they could not establish the fact that they were legitimately of the family of Aaron. Therefore, to be safe, the governor very wisely said, you know what? Until we get a priest in here with the Urim and Thummim, I don't want you eating any of the holy bread. I don't want you doing anything along the lines of priestly duties until we can confirm that you are who you say you are. Okay. You know, there's a whole bunch of stuff on social media right now about, you know, these rumors kind of start. You know, these immigrants are coming across the border and they're letting them across the border and then giving them a ballot, telling them to go vote. You know, this kind of stuff. And they're saying, you know, you have to provide documentation of your citizenship to do everything else, but not to vote. Well, that's not true. That's not true. I went to vote yesterday, and they know me. You know, we walk in, they call us by name, but guess what? We still had to show our driver's license. You know, we still had to document who we were. You know, I kind of kidded around and I said, now if I vote today, when can I vote again? And the Frost girl said, in 2 years. So she was like that. But the point is, sometimes we are called upon to document who we are. You can't just say, I'm so-and-so. You have to show that you are who you say you are. You know? Right? I mean, you know, if there are many times, like I might go to the bank or something, they know me at the bank, but before they do something, they're going to say, we need to know your date of birth or something. Yeah. 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 Well, now I know that. Scan it and get all personal information and see if it matches up to you. All right. Well, good. Well, you look, you know, I can see why. You look a little suspicious. I know. No, that's interesting. And that just is another example of the need for security. But here it wasn't for security reasons. Here it was because the governor and the leaders did not want to do something that was contrary to God's law. You know? And so to be a part of the Jewish community, and especially be a part of the Jewish community and have duties that were associated with the worship and sacrifices and things like that, you had to prove your credentials. Now, we talked about this earlier, but do you remember what the Urim and Thummim was? Wasn't all the priests. Which priest was it?
The high priest.
Just the high priest. The high priest had, you can go back and read, it's pretty interesting when the Old Testament talks about the attire of the high priest. And one thing he had was this breastplate that had 12 different kinds of precious stones. And each one of those stones represented one of the 12 tribes. Okay, but they were all precious stones. And then he also had this thing called the Urim and the Thummim. And to be honest, nobody really knows what that is. We've just done a lot of research over the centuries, and the best we can find out is that it was two special stones. One was called the Urim, and apparently there wasn't a lot of difference between the two, except that one was on one side and one was on the other. And priests used those stones, the high priest used those stones to communicate with God. And if it was almost like a yes-no thing. God, should I do this? And if the Urim did something, then the answer was yes. If the Thummim did something, the answer was no. We don't know what that was. Some people think that they may have just begun to glow, and others think they may have generated heat. And the priest could feel the heat. No, well, he said yes to that. He said no to that. But it was God's way of communicating with priests. And it was God's only way of communicating with priests, which means that if these people claimed that they were a priestly origin, they could go to the high priest, and the high priest would say, God, tell me, is this guy really a priest or not? Oh, no, you're not. No, and did it that way. But it was gonna, in other words, if you couldn't document it with papers, God would document it through the Urim and the Thummim. Okay, enough about that. So now, under the law of Moses, I said no one could serve as a priest unless it could be established that this man was indeed a descendant of Aaron. Okay, so next one. The total number of all these that we listed was 42,360. That was the total number of those who were in the original group to return from Persia and Babylon and occupy Judah and Jerusalem. That's identical to the number in Ezra 2. If you compare the other numbers in Ezra 2 to Nehemiah 7, some of them don't match up, okay? But that doesn't mean that the Bible contradicts itself. It just means two different records will just do that sometimes. They'll just do that. One person will be counted as a member of this family one way and be counted as a member of another family this way. So anyway, but the total number was the same, 42,360. And then these verses, 66 through 69, list the numbers of all the servants, the singers, the horses, the mules, the camels, and the donkeys. Okay. Now that's a pretty thorough census when you start counting all the donkeys and mules. Okay. Then verses 70 through 72, we get this same report in the book of Ezra, the contributions made by the first returnees. If you remember, when they left, they were given lots of things from the king to take with them to get the temple rebuilt and so forth. And when they arrived at that stuff, they made another accounting of it to make sure everything had made the trip. And so now other people who came from Babylon and Persia with some of their own material things contributed of their things to help rebuild the temple and to equip the priests and Levites for their work. But now at the end of Nehemiah 7, the temple's been completed for many years and the walls of the city were completed entirely. So all these contributions made by these people in Ezra chapter 2 were put to good use. Now, just the last verse, close, okay. And the last verse says, now the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, some of the people, the temple servants in all Israel lived in their cities. So when it says some of the people, I think what it's meaning is most of the people lived in Jerusalem. But there were smaller villages and towns round about where people lived. And things are established now. That's all it's saying here. The priests, the Levites, the gate singer, and some of the temple servants, and all they lived in their cities. Everything was being established. Jerusalem was now a bona fide city. And when the seventh month came, the scripture says, the sons of Israel were in their cities. So, what do we know? That means Jerusalem and Judah were reestablished. The people had a temple. The city was once again a fortified city, but it wasn't like before because there's no palace. They had no king. They only had a governor, and that governor was appointed by the king of Persia. They had no army. Okay. So, their former glory was long gone. But this remnant could now legitimately consider themselves a nation, but they were a nation within the greater nation of Persia. And